You walk 30 minutes every morning, 5 days a week, and you have done this for years. Your doctor approves. The guidelines agree. 150 minutes of moderate activity per week, and you have met the prescription consistently. Last Tuesday, you sprinted across a rain-soaked car park because you were late. You arrived at the door breathless, speech broken, heart pounding, and the moment passed. You did not count it. You did not remember it when the questionnaire at your next appointment asked how many minutes of vigorous exercise you did last week. Nobody counts the sprint across the car park. Nobody counts the 2 minutes playing chase with a grandchild that left you unable to speak. Nobody counts climbing 3 flights fast because the lift was occupied. For 30 years, the instrument that built the exercise guidelines you follow could not count them either. And those moments, the ones too brief to remember, too spontaneous to schedule, too short to feel like exercise, turn out to be the ones your biology responds to most. Instrument was a questionnaire, a form handed to you at a doctor's office asking how many minutes of moderate or vigorous exercise you did last week. Questionnaire captures deliberate, sustained, memorable activity, the 30-minute walk you scheduled, the gym session you planned. These register in conscious recall because they were initiated by intention and sustained long enough to feel like events. 90-second sprint does not register. The breathless stair climb does not register. The hard minutes of play do not register. They are invisible to memory because they were spontaneous, brief, and absorbed into the ordinary fabric of a day where you were simply living rather than exercising. The instrument that built the guidelines systematically could not see them. Worse, the instrument could not measure intensity. It captured categories, light, moderate, vigorous, as self-reported labels applied by memory to activities the person may have genuinely misclassified. One person's brisk is another person's stroll. The 2-to-1 ratio encoded into every exercise guideline for the last 30 years, telling you that 150 minutes of moderate activity equals 75 minutes of vigorous, was calculated from calorie expenditure rather than from who developed disease and who did not. Calorie math dressed as mortality science. You now know the instrument was broken and the ratio it produced was built on the wrong question. What changes when the instrument changes? From recall to measurement, from questionnaire to accelerometer, is where the data collapses every ratio the walking routine was built on. Accelerometers changed the science, because when the instrument changed, the science changed with it. In the last decade, researchers began strapping accelerometers, devices recording actual movement, actual intensity, continuously, in real time, to large populations and tracking what happened to them across years. Deaths from all causes, cardiovascular deaths, cancer deaths, diabetes onset, stroke. For the first time in the history of exercise science, the relationship between physical activity and mortality was measured directly. Not recalled, not estimated, not filtered through the unreliable aperture of human memory. Every brief, vigorous burst that the questionnaire had made invisible suddenly appeared in the data. The 90-second sprint, the fast stair climb, the breathless minutes of play, these had been occurring in the bodies of people who showed up in mortality data as mysteriously healthier than their questionnaire responses predicted. The accelerometer explained why. Researchers had noted this as unexplained variance, statistical noise, confounding variables. The accelerometer eliminated the noise. What was variance became signal. When the data was analyzed against mortality outcomes, the 2-to-1 ratio did not require revision. It collapsed. For all-cause mortality, 1 minute of vigorous activity equals 4 minutes of moderate activity. 4-to-1. For cardiovascular death, the outcome that statistically determines whether you see your 80th birthday, 1 minute of vigorous activity equals 8 minutes of moderate. 8-to-1. The guideline ratio was wrong by a factor of 4 for the leading cause of death in the developed world. For type 2 diabetes risk, 1 minute of vigorous activity equals 10 minutes of moderate. 10-to-1. People who moved in short, intense bursts through daily life had been appearing in the mortality data as healthier for 30 years. The accelerometer revealed why, and the numbers were not adjustments. They were replacements, as Stamatakis and colleagues documented in Nature Medicine using wrist-worn accelerometer data from over 25,000 adults tracked across nearly 7 years. In women specifically, accumulating just 3.5 minutes of vigorous activity per day, not sustained, not in a gym, simply accumulated across the day in whatever spontaneous form it arrived, reduced cancer risk by 40%. From 3.5 daily minutes that the questionnaire could not count, that the guidelines could not see, that the morning walk was never delivering. No drug in a cancer prevention clinical trial has produced a 40% risk reduction without significant side effects. This number came from the moments the questionnaire had been discarding for 30 years. Dose response above 3.5 minutes continues. More vigorous minutes produce more protection, with the steepest part of the curve sitting between 0 and 4 minutes daily. The first 3.5 minutes produce the largest relative reduction in risk. Minutes 4 through 10 produce additional but progressively smaller increments. Above 10 daily vigorous minutes, the curve flattens. The incremental protection per additional minute diminishes, though it does not disappear. The practical implication: someone accumulating 3.5 minutes daily receives the majority of the protection. 7 minutes daily provides more. 15 provides most. The data supports. But the gap between 0 vigorous minutes and 3.5 is larger than the gap between 3.5 and 15, which means the first 3.5 minutes matter more than the next 11 combined. The question changes from what the broken instrument missed to what the body does differently when the intensity crosses the threshold those moments represent. And then, what changes inside the body at the moment breathing becomes the limiting factor, because there are 3 distinct operating modes, and the boundary between them is where the molecular cascade lives. Among the great apes, humans alone require exercise to maintain metabolic health. Chimpanzees share 97% of human DNA and spend 8 to 10 hours a day resting, grooming, and eating before sleeping for 9 to 10 hours. In their few active hours, they walk approximately a mile. In captivity, they are even less active, and they remain lean, cardiovascularly healthy, with minimal heart disease or diabetes. Gorillas do even less. Every other great ape stays healthy without deliberate movement, confirmed by Poncer's comparative research at Duke University, published in Scientific American. Humans cannot. Reason sits in a single evolutionary transition, when our ancestors moved from the sedentary gathering lifestyle of the forest onto the savanna as hunter-gatherers. Walking 5 to 10 miles a day, carrying loads, sprinting after prey and away from predators. Human physiology was rewired to depend on the signaling molecules that active muscles release into the bloodstream. Myokines, hormones produced by contracting muscle, became required inputs for insulin sensitivity, immune function, fat clearance from the blood, inflammatory regulation, and brain maintenance. Every organ system was re-engineered to expect these signals as daily input. Exercise for humans is a biochemical requirement that no other primate shares, an evolutionary consequence of the transition that separated us from our cousins roughly 3 million years ago. Question, then, is which intensity produces which signals, because the answer divides into 3 distinct operating modes that determine whether the body receives the maintenance signals or the protection signals. The mortality data measured. Light activity is the locomotion of daily life. Moving between rooms, walking at a comfortable pace, heart rate barely shifts. Type 1 slow twitch muscle fibers handle the load. Moderate intensity is the morning walk, a brisk, purposeful stride. Breathing elevates but remains conversational, sustainable for hours. Type 1 fibers are working, a fraction of Type 2A intermediate fibers are recruited, cardiovascular demand increases measurably. This is the gear the guidelines validated and the walk delivers. Vigorous intensity is a different operating mode entirely. The distinguishing feature is respiratory limitation. The lungs become the constraint. Speech fragments. Breathing becomes audible. The body has crossed a metabolic threshold, and the molecular cascade that activates on the other side of that threshold cannot be produced by moderate intensity regardless of duration. The cascade begins in the muscle fibers your morning walk has never recruited. Now, Type 2 fibers, because these are the muscles that produce the protein your brain needs through a delivery route that moderate walking cannot activate. Your muscles contain 2 broad categories of fiber. Type 1 slow twitch fibers dominate during moderate activity. Fatigue-resistant, efficient, recruited during walking, light cycling, and sustained low-intensity movement. Your morning walk uses almost exclusively Type 1 fibers. Type 2 fast twitch fibers are recruited only when the intensity exceeds what Type 1 fibers can sustain. Higher force, higher power, faster fatigue. They fire when you sprint for a bus, climb stairs fast, or play chase until breathless. They are the fibers your 30-minute walk has never called upon because the walk never demanded more than the type 1 fibers could provide. Type 2 fibers are the primary site of BDNF production in skeletal muscle. The BDNF and hippocampal growth the walking discussion described were measured at moderate intensity. What that discussion did not cover is the delivery route, because BDNF production scales with fiber type recruitment. Moderate walking produces hippocampal growth through modest BDNF delivery via type 1 fibers. Vigorous effort that recruits type 2 fibers delivers categorically more BDNF through a fiber type. The walk never activates the same growth signal delivered at higher concentration through a recruitment threshold the walk never crosses. The cognitive reserve that determines whether a person in their 70s notices the early losses of neurodegeneration scales with the BDNF concentration the hippocampus receives and the concentration scales with the fiber type producing it. Type 2 fibers have a second relevance beyond BDNF that connects directly to the sarcopenia you are already experiencing. Sarcopenia, the age-related loss of muscle mass and function, preferentially destroys type 2 fibers. Type 1 fibers are relatively preserved with age because they are recruited during daily activities. Type 2 fibers, which require high-intensity demand to recruit, atrophy through disuse because the daily activities of most adults over 50 never demand their activation. The morning walk maintains type 1 fibers and does nothing for type 2. The fibers that are atrophying fastest are the fibers the walk never reaches. Brief, vigorous efforts recruit type 2 fibers under load, the only stimulus that signals the neuromuscular system to maintain them. Climbing stairs fast, sprinting briefly, carrying heavy loads, these recruit the fibers that are disappearing. The walk preserves what is already being preserved. The threshold crossing preserves what is being lost. The distinction matters because the functional losses that determine independence after 70, the ability to rise from a chair without assistance, to catch yourself during a stumble, to generate the force needed to open a heavy door, are type 2 fiber functions. The morning walk does not train them. The brief, breathless effort does. Bone density adds a third dimension to the threshold crossing that moderate walking cannot replicate. Bone responds to impact loading. The piezoelectric signals generated when bone deforms under force stimulate osteoblast activity and maintain mineral density. Walking produces impact forces of roughly 1 to 1.5 times body weight per step. Fast stair climbing produces 3 to 4 times body weight. A brief sprint produces forces that exceed walking by a factor of 2 to 3. The mechanical loading that signals bone to maintain its density scales with impact force, and the impact force scales with intensity. The walking guideline produces sufficient loading to slow bone loss modestly. The threshold crossing produces loading at the intensity the bone remodeling data was measured at. The forces that maintain density rather than merely slowing its decline. For anyone with osteopenia, the pre-osteoporotic state that affects the majority of women over 60 and a significant proportion of men, the distinction between moderate and vigorous impact loading may be the distinction between maintaining bone density and losing it despite the walking routine the guidelines recommended. You now know what the threshold crossing builds in the muscle, the bone, and the brain. The question changes from what the threshold produces in individual tissues to what it triggers across the body's immune, cardiovascular, and metabolic systems, and why the aging body crosses it more easily with every decade. Mitochondrial density in type 2 fibers declines faster than in type 1 fibers after 50. The energy-producing machinery that supports high-force contraction degrades through the combined effects of reduced recruitment. The fibers are never called upon, and age-related mitochondrial DNA damage that accumulates more rapidly in dormant tissues. AMPK activation. The pathway the fasted walking discussion described responds more intensely to vigorous effort than to moderate walking. The energy deficit per unit of time is greater, the signal is proportionally more intense, and the mitochondrial biogenesis response in type 2 fibers, specifically, is triggered only by the recruitment that moderate walking never provides. Maintaining type 2 fiber mitochondrial density after 50 requires the recruitment stimulus that crosses the threshold. Without it, the fibers lose both their contractile protein and their metabolic machinery simultaneously. Sleep quality improves measurably in response to vigorous activity, through a pathway that moderate walking activates weakly. Sleep pressure scales with ATP consumption rate. Vigorous effort consumes ATP at a rate moderate walking does not approach. The deeper adenosine load from accumulated vigorous minutes produces stronger sleep pressure at bedtime, faster sleep onset, and more time in slow-wave deep sleep. The sleep stage during which growth hormone is released, tissue repair occurs, and the glymphatic waste clearance system operates at peak efficiency. Adding 3.5 vigorous minutes to a day that previously contained only moderate activity often reports improved sleep quality within the first week. The adenosine load that the walk was not sufficient to build is now present at bedtime, and the sleep architecture responds. Lactate next, because there is a second delivery route for the same growth signal, and it operates through a molecule most people were taught is waste. When muscles operate beyond aerobic capacity, past the vigorous threshold, they produce lactate. Lactate was mischaracterized for decades as a fatigue toxin, the burn that limits performance. Lactate is a signaling molecule, as Brooks established in cell metabolism. It crosses the blood-brain barrier freely through monocarboxylate transporters and directly stimulates hippocampal BDNF production through an independent pathway. Two independent delivery mechanisms for one neuroprotective signal. One from the type 2 muscle fibers themselves released into the bloodstream and crossing the blood-brain barrier within minutes. One from lactate produced by those fibers crossing through its own transport channels and stimulating hippocampal BDNF production locally, both activated by the same threshold crossing. Neither activated during moderate intensity sustained indefinitely. Mental clarity after something physically hard. The sharpness, the focus that arrives without caffeine, is BDNF. Inside the skull, measurable in cerebrospinal fluid within 4 minutes of the gear shift, delivered through 2 routes simultaneously. The walk produces a trickle. The threshold crossing opens both taps. And then, the immune cascade, because this is the mechanism that explains the 40% cancer risk reduction from 3.5 daily minutes. The threshold crossing triggers a sympathetic nervous system surge. Epinephrine and norepinephrine released from the adrenal medulla into the bloodstream. The catecholamine surge produces 3 simultaneous effects that moderate intensity cannot generate. Natural killer cell deployment. NK cells, the immune cells that patrol for precancerous cells, cells that have undergone malignant transformation but have not yet formed detectable tumors, mobilize from the spleen, lymph nodes, and vascular margins into active circulation. Their numbers in the bloodstream increase measurably within minutes of the threshold crossing. Their cytotoxic activity, their ability to identify and destroy abnormal cells, increases simultaneously. The cancer immunosurveillance system deploys at heightened capacity for hours after the vigorous burst ends. Interleukin-6, released from contracting muscle during intense exercise, acts as a myokine, a muscle-produced hormone that crosses into the systemic circulation and signals anti-inflammatory pathways in organs far from the muscle that produced it. Chronic low-grade inflammation drives cancer initiation and progression. The interleukin-6 myokine signal from intense muscular work is one of the mechanisms connecting brief, vigorous activity to cancer outcomes at the cellular level. Heat shock proteins surge and endogenous antioxidant enzyme systems upregulate. Superoxide dismutase, catalase, glutathione peroxidase. The antioxidant machinery that protects DNA from oxidative damage is induced by the very oxidative stress that intense exercise briefly creates. The mild damage triggers the protective adaptation. A biological principle where the stress that vigorous effort produces is the signal that tells the DNA repair machinery to strengthen. Walk does not recruit the fiber type that produces the catecholamine surge. The surge does not occur at moderate intensity. The NK cells stay in their resting positions. The myokine signal is absent. The antioxidant upregulation does not trigger. The cancer protection. The 3.5-minute data identified requires the threshold crossing that the walk, however long, never provides. Well, VO2 max, because the biology is designed so that less effort is needed with each decade to cross the threshold that matters most. VO2 max, the maximum rate at which the body can consume oxygen during exercise, declines approximately 10% per decade after 30. The vigorous threshold sits at approximately 64 to 76% of VO2 max. As VO2 max declines, the absolute intensity required to cross the threshold declines with it. At 30, VO2 max might be 40 milliliters per kilogram per minute. The vigorous threshold sits at approximately 28, requiring a genuine jog or fast cycling to reach. At 60, VO2 max has declined to approximately 28. The vigorous threshold now sits at approximately 20, reachable by climbing stairs briskly, walking fast up a moderate hill, or playing actively with a grandchild. Threshold came down to meet the aging body. The 60-year-old reaches vigorous intensity at efforts that were moderate at 30 because VO2 max decline and threshold percentage are mathematically coupled. The effort that makes a 60-year-old breathless is the vigorous threshold for their current physiology. If you climb 2 flights of stairs and arrive breathless at the top, you have crossed the vigorous threshold. Type 2 fibers recruited. BDNF production initiated through both delivery routes. Lactate crossing the blood-brain barrier. NK cells deploying. You thought you were climbing stairs. Your biology was running the full molecular cascade that the accelerometer data says matters most. Activated because the threshold came down to meet the effort. Your ordinary day already provides. After that number, the breathlessness at the top of the stairs reads differently now, a confirmation rather than a complaint, the lungs reporting that the gear shifted and the molecular cascade was running. Blood pressure adds a dimension, the moderate walking guidelines never captured. Brief, intense effort produces a transient blood pressure spike during the effort. Systolic pressure can reach 180 to 200 millimeters of mercury for the seconds the burst lasts. After the burst, the arterial baroreceptors recalibrate to the spike, and blood pressure drops below baseline for 2 to 4 hours, a phenomenon called post-exercise hypertension. The magnitude of the post-exercise drop scales with the intensity of the effort. Moderate walking produces a modest drop. Vigorous bursts produce a larger, longer-lasting reduction. For anyone with stage 1 hypertension, the brief, breathless burst may produce a 4 to 6 hour blood pressure reduction that the morning walk does not achieve at the same magnitude. Cardiac output dimension connects to the cardiovascular 8:1 ratio. Brief, vigorous effort demands maximum stroke volume. The heart must pump more blood per beat than moderate intensity requires. Repeated threshold crossings train the heart to maintain a higher stroke volume at rest, the cardiac remodeling that increases end diastolic volume and reduces resting heart rate. The walk maintains cardiac function. The threshold crossing improves it, the distinction between maintenance and adaptation that the 8:1 ratio captures. Heart rate recovery after the burst is itself a diagnostic you can perform without equipment. After climbing 2 flights fast and arriving breathless at the top, count the seconds until the heart rate feels normal, until the pounding settles and breathing returns to conversational. Heart rate recovery speed correlates directly with cardiovascular fitness and all-cause mortality in population studies. A heart that recovers to near resting within 60 to 90 seconds is cardiovascularly fit. A heart that takes 3 to 4 minutes indicates reduced vagal tone and lower cardiovascular reserve. The recovery speed improves with repeated threshold crossings. Each burst trains the autonomic reflexes that bring the heart rate down, and the improvement is measurable within weeks. If you notice the stair climb produces breathlessness that resolves faster after a month of daily stair taking, you are observing improved vagal recovery, a cardiovascular adaptation that the morning walk does not produce at equivalent magnitude because the walk never elevated the heart rate enough to train the recovery reflex. Frequency matters because the biology responds differently to daily brief bursts than to weekly sustained sessions. 3.5 daily minutes of vigorous activity, accumulated in 30 to 90-second fragments across the day, produces different molecular signaling than 25 consecutive minutes once a week, even though the weekly total is identical. The daily pattern provides repeated AMPK activation cycles, repeated NK cell deployments, repeated post-exercise blood pressure reductions, and repeated BDNF delivery events. The weekly pattern provides one of each. The molecular adaptations: enzyme upregulation, mitochondrial biogenesis, receptor sensitivity changes, respond to frequency of the activation signal, and daily signals produce stronger adaptation than weekly signals at equivalent total volume. The accelerometer data captures this. The people with the strongest mortality protection were not the weekend warriors who exercised hard once. They were the people whose ordinary days contained frequent brief moments of breathlessness woven through the fabric of living. Timing of the threshold crossing within the day connects to the circadian physiology that governs muscle performance. Core temperature peaks between 3 and 5 in the afternoon. The window when muscle contractile force, joint flexibility, and pain tolerance are all at their daily maximum. Crossing the vigorous threshold during this window produces the strongest muscle fiber recruitment with the lowest injury risk. Morning threshold crossings. Climbing stairs fast on the way to work, walking briskly up the hill during the morning walk are safe and effective, but occur when the musculoskeletal system is cooler and stiffer. The afternoon window is optimal for the highest intensity bursts. The morning is optimal for the bursts woven into the walking routine you already perform. The threshold crossing is an addition. 3.5 minutes accumulated across an ordinary day, layered on top of the walking routine you already maintain. Walk is the foundation. The brief breathless moments are the molecular layer the foundation does not reach. Beta blockers deserve specific mention because they affect the threshold calculation directly. Beta blockers cap heart rate by blocking the adrenergic receptors that increase cardiac output during exertion. If you take atenolol, metoprolol, or any beta blocker, your heart rate response to vigorous effort is blunted. You may cross the respiratory threshold while your heart rate remains deceptively low. The threshold is defined by respiratory limitation, not heart rate. If speech fragments and breathing becomes the limiting factor, you have crossed the threshold regardless of what the heart rate monitor reads. The monitor is tracking a pharmacologically altered signal. The lungs are reporting the unaltered metabolic reality. Anyone with diagnosed cardiac disease, uncontrolled hypertension, or recent cardiac events should discuss the threshold crossing with their physician before adding vigorous bursts. The molecular cascade is real. The cardiovascular demand is also real. The transient blood pressure spike during the burst requires a cardiovascular system that can accommodate the load safely. For most adults with stable health, the 30 to 90-second burst is well within physiological tolerance. For anyone with unstable conditions, the physician determines the safety boundary. That cascade, a threshold the aging body crosses more easily with each decade, a fiber type that produces the protein the brain needs through 2 delivery routes and maintains the bone density and muscle mass. The walk cannot reach, an immune deployment. The 40% cancer reduction was measured against, and a blood pressure recalibration. The moderate walk produces at a fraction of the magnitude, is why the stairs are now a 3-flight molecular intervention I build into every afternoon rather than an inconvenience I avoid. Walk is real, walk is beneficial, and the gear the walk is beneficial. And the 90 seconds where speech fragments and the lungs become the limit is where the largest protection lives. The threshold takes 30 seconds to initiate. The heart responds within 90 seconds. The brain receives BDNF within 4 minutes. The immune system deploys for hours. The blood pressure recalibrates for the afternoon. 3.5 minutes accumulated across whatever form Tuesday offers. The gear was always there. The instrument that could see it arrived 30 years late.